Oh, hey, One Lit Teacher here. Today I'm taking a look at Spenser's Sonnet 75. This is one of the most famous poems in his sonnet cycle called the Amoretti. And the opening line is, "One day I wrote her name upon the strand." This is personally my favorite Spenser sonnet. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. It's important to get a firm sense of the setting right away. I'm going to discuss vocabulary in just a few moments, but strand, importantly, is a beach. So the poem takes place on the beach, where if you write something in the sand, the tide may come and wipe it away. Again, I wrote it with a second hand, became the tide and made my pains his prey. So it was wiped out again. And here there's another character coming in to view with the narrator, who is Spenser himself. "Vain man," said she, "thou doest in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize, for I myself shall like to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise." She's really calling him foolish for making this futile effort to write in the sand, because the waves are just going to wash it away, just very much like she'll be wiped from the earth in short time. "Not so," quote I, "let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall live by fame." So things that aren't as beautiful or important as she may go by the wayside, but my verse, your virtues rare, shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name, where when as death shall all the world subdue, our love shall live, and later life renew. It's really a beautiful poem. And before I get into discussing the color marking, which of course is my favorite method of poetry analysis, I'm just going to talk about a few of the basics of the poem in terms of format and structure. So this, of course, is not a Shakespearean sonnet. However, Spenser, as I may have mentioned at the beginning, was a contemporary of Shakespeare's, and he had his own very unique sonnet form. Not an Italian Petrarchan, not an English Shakespearean, but rather a Spenserian sonnet, and Spenser was the only one to write them. They were very complicated in terms of rhyme because there were so many rhyming sounds. These poems have interlocking rhyme, so each quatrain is connected to the next by the end sound of the last line. A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, and then E, E, the rhyming couplet, completes the rhyme scheme of a Spenserian sonnet. I've marked that here so you can see we give the first letter of the alphabet to each new sound. And if you need some help with rhyme and or meter, I have some other videos on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, about poetry basics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right now. It is 3 quatrains and a couplet, much like a Shakespearean sonnet. And in this poem, each portion is separated by end punctuation, in this case, a very definitive period at the end of each portion. It is, of course, written in iambic pentameter, which was the meter of the day, which is intended to mirror the cadence of our normal, the rise and fall of our normal speech in English. I've marked just the first line. "One day I wrote her name upon the strand," to show you the 5 feet or 5 units of iambs here. I will, in my color marking, mark the entire poem, but I'm only going to spend the time to point out the lines that maybe just need a little bit of thought on our part to see how they fit into the meter. Again, if you need help with meter, please check out my Poetry Basics video. There is a volta, or a turn, in line 9 here, where the speaker comes in and says, "Not so," and changes up the thinking in the poem. Frequently in a Shakespearean sonnet, that volta comes at the couplet, not always, but here in this Spenserian sonnet, Spenser puts it at the beginning of the final quatrain in line 9. This poem is unusual, I think, in that it relies very heavily on dialogue, and I'm going to talk in a little bit about the narrative aspects of the poem. First, though, there are some important vocabulary words that we might need to talk about in order to firmly understand the poem. As I mentioned previously, the strand is the beach or the stretch of land that meets the ocean. Assay in line 5 means to examine or analyze. Now, when I look at it and kind of think about how writing plays a key role in the argument of the poem, I see that there could also be a subtle pun here, because essay looks like and sounds a lot like the word essay, which of course is a form of writing or analysis in writing. Eke in line 9 is an expression of surprise, but again, perhaps a pun on eke, eke, which means to make something against odds, to eke something out. And in this case, he's eking her name in the sand and hoping it will stay, but of course it doesn't. I think I mentioned the word baser earlier, and I'm just going to reiterate that, even though I don't have it in my notes here. At line 9, baser things are things that are sort of less perfect than she is. And then in line 9, the word quod is a variation of the archaic word quoth, to say. Of course, if you're familiar with Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, you might know the line, quoth the raven, nevermore. If not, no worries. It's really not relevant to this poem other than they both use that similar word. I mentioned there are some narrative qualities to this poem, even though it's a lyric or personal, emotional poem. It has a storyline in it. So to start with, as I mentioned, there is a setting. It is one day, as the opening words tell us, at the beach upon the strand. And there are two characters in the poem. The speaker, who we can assume is Spenser himself, and his lover, who is a woman. And we can really get the personalities of both of them. She is sort of sassy and contradicting of him, but also a realist, while he is, of course, a poet, more romantic and lofty perhaps in his ideas. But he also has a little bit of an ego here, because I think that there's a little bit of egotism in the idea that their love will be immortalized through this poem, because Spenser is, of course, assuming that the poem will live forever and it will be important and people will read it forever. The point of view of the story or narrative of the poem is first person. Spenser is a character and the speaker, and he uses first person pronouns I and our. The story has an arc or a story pattern. It has a beginning, rising action, a climax, and an end, okay? And we can follow that storyline in a very compact way here. The theme is eternal beauty, which sort of melds with the idea of eternal love and immortality, their love and her beauty living on forever through this poem. It's a beautiful idea. Here I have given you my first layer of what I call color marking, my handwritten analysis of the poem, where again, I have marked the Spenserian rhyme scheme with the interlocking rhyme, and I've shown you the different quatrains and the couplet and how we can really see them clearly by looking at the rhyme scheme off to the side and also paying attention to the punctuation. And then I also have marked the iambic pentameter, 5 units or 5 feet of iambs per line. And again, you can look at this in my Poetry Basics video on my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher. But a few lines where I want to just point out, sometimes the poet has to take a little poetic license and the reader has to sort of go with it to make the meter work out or stay intact. So for example, in the second line, but came the waves and washed it away. That's the only way that we get 10 syllables out of the line. And there's another hypermeter at the end of the second quatrain with line 8, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Dee-dum, 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 dee-dum. So we just know that Spenser intended that extra syllable because it is iambic pentameter. Again, the setting and the details that define the setting are some of the things I noticed first when reading the poem. I noticed right away that it's in nature, specifically the ocean, and so I marked in that kind of aqua blue for water, I guess, words like strand and waves, tide, and this firmly sets the setting for me. Later on, I'm going to come to the realization that that setting is the opposite of the eternal setting that the poet argues for later on, but we'll get to that. I also marked the writing motif in red with obviously some repetition of the word wrote, write, and then also just writing ideas like second hand. You need your hand to write, and he wrote it with a second hand. Essay, as I mentioned earlier, which could be sort of a subtle pun. Eke, when we think about it as a pun, he is writing her name and it's wiped out or erased, which also goes along with the idea of writing. And of course, verse, which is poetry, is mentioned in the middle of the third quatrain. Then I marked the repetition in green. It looks sort of suspiciously like blue on the screen here, but it's green. And it is words like wrote and mortal, immortalized. So they're not exactly the same word, but there is a form of repetition in the idea and the embedding of one word inside the other there. And then the words die and death, which are very close, live, life. Frequently, if my students have no idea what a poem is about, I will sometimes just tell them to mark repetition first, because repetition very often is a key to author's purpose and theme. And if you started, or if I had started with repetition here, I would have probably come to a lot of the same conclusions that I've already mentioned here. In another layer, I added a few things. The alliteration in the poem jumps out at me, for example, with the W's, wrote, write, and M's in the fourth line, made, my, and P's, pains, pray. For alliteration, though, I tell students, sometimes it is coincidental, sometimes it's important, it could slow down the momentum of a poem or emphasize certain words, but it's not always the most important thing to mention, and you don't always have to talk about or write about everything that you mark in a poem. To me, the most important alliteration in the poem is in the final line, our love shall live and later life renew, because it sort of gives a firm foundation to the idea at the end of the poem. And even the word shall has that L sound, in this case in consonants, at the end of the word shall. Okay, and then I began to mark some antithesis. These are opposite ideas that are very close together, like die and live in quatrain 3, and that would be line 10, and then also death and life in the couplet. It helped me to see a higher level idea in the poem, which I'll get to in a moment, which is sort of an antithesis of the settings and the overall meaning of the poem. I also marked personification just because the idea that death is capitalized jumped out at me, and that death has power that could sort of be ascribed to a human in this poem. Again, I don't know that it's particularly consequential, but I noticed it. So again, the alliteration strengthens the theme. By the way, color marking is imperfect, and I marked some alliteration and then added some later, so I may not have everything marked here, but it is a dynamic process, color marking. Antithesis drives the message, and again, I'm going to show you how I got to the final idea in the poem that way. So I noticed that the setting, which begins very importantly on the strand or the beach where her name is wiped away, morphs by the end of the poem into this idea of eternity in the heavens, this sort of celestial idea where their souls are together as one. And so the higher meaning of the poem is really an antithesis. The idea that life is fleeting on earth, but not our souls together in eternity. And that is an important part of the message of the poem. So in the third quatrain, then I went ahead and boxed off an idea that helped me to see it. To die in dust, but you shall live by fame. So again, there's this sort of soul eternity idea, but also this aspect of a little bit of bragging on the part of the poet. Aha. Earthly life is fleeting, the poet says, but writing, specifically poetry, can document or bear witness to eternal life and love, which he sees as sort of one here. So Spenser's ego plays an important role in this poem, and in that way it reminds me a lot of Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, which of course famously begins, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" And in that poem, though, Shakespeare sort of chides the woman for not seeing that her beauty is fleeting and that there are more important things in life. And he also ends with this idea about how important his poetry is. He ends with a couplet, "So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, my poem, and this gives life to thee." So Spenser does that a little bit more subtly, I think, with a little bit more deference to her wisdom and her soul. But they're both right in their egotism because we are reading these poems over 400 years later. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher. Thank you.